Welcome to anybody watching or listening to the audio of this interview. Today I'm interviewing Dr. Swan Dao, and we'll be talking around the area of the devotional arts. But before I get Swan to introduce himself, I'd like to say a little bit about phenomenal conversations. So phenomenal conversations are crafted and curated to help bring in a regenerative worldview and culture. And we do that by interviewing pioneers like Swan that are living the change. We try to amplify and increase imagination in the midst of the polycrisis. We try to ask meaningful questions and amplify nuance in a chaotic world. And then we try to ask the kind of most pertinent issues that are relevant in today's emerging world. And there are two formats to phenomenal conversations. This format is a one-on-one interview, but mostly monthly, I have a live interview with a change maker, and we engage in group discussions, and we come to a kind of harvest of collective wisdom where the expertise of the speaker stimulates everybody's interpersonal wisdom. So that's it about phenomenal conversations. Very, very pleased to welcome you here today, Swan. I'm sure we're going to have a fascinating discussion. And I'd love you to give the audience that may be unfamiliar with you a little synopsis of your background and how you came to be where you are today.
Thank you for your kind invitation, Dave. I'm pleased to be speaking with you today. So I'm Swan Dao. Officially, I am a psychotherapist, coach, and educator. That means I have clients that I see individually and also work a lot with groups. I organize training courses for therapists and retreats for the general public through the organization I founded, the Institute of Devotional Arts. My academic background is in philosophy and theology and comparative religion. I spent a long time in academia teaching, and then I went to drama school. I also spent a lot of time in religious communities and intentional communities of different kinds all over the world. And I'm currently in Vietnam, where half of my family is from.
Okay, well, that was a very brief synopsis. So I'd love you to explain to the audience, because I've encountered you in Oxford for the first time last year, and you mentioned your mixed background, as it were. You've come from a number of spiritual lineages or traditions. I'd love for you to, if you're, as much as you're willing to share with the audience about that, because I feel that is an interesting part of your makeup as a character.
Certainly. So I'm Eurasian, half European, half Asian. On my father's side of the family, they come from northern and southern Vietnam and Cambodia. So they're Buddhists and Caodaists. Caodaism is a syncretic tradition that's similar to the Baha'i faith, in that it's monotheistic, but it believes that Jesus, Muhammad, the Buddha are different prophets interpreting the divine message in different ways at different times. And my great-grandfather was one of the pioneers of that tradition from southern Vietnam. I believe it's now the third biggest religion in Vietnam, and it can be found all over the world because of the Vietnamese diaspora. On my mother's side, they're mainly French Catholics and also Anglicans from England, and some of my ancestors were missionaries in Africa.
Okay, so your parents met, was that as a result of the colonial relationship between France and Vietnam?
Not at all. They met at medical school.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yes.
And that your was it your grandfather, you said, that founded Cao Dao, was it?
Caodaism, or the Dao Dai faith. Well, he was among the pioneers. There were several founders. I wouldn't say he was the founder.
And did that have an influence on your early life? Did you have much contact with him? Did it form you in any way?
So I've never met him, in a distant way.
Right.
And so far as my grandmother did practice to some extent, and she was all of that surprised when I became vegetarian as a teenager, because a lot of Caodais are vegetarian.
Okay.
Which was very uncommon in France at the time. And it wasn't so much the deep theology I was exposed to. It was the daily practices.
Okay.
Things you see in Vietnamese homes everywhere, even here. The altar, the ancestor worship, photos of our ancestors. When you enter the house, you always pray and light incense. It's those kinds of daily practices that I was exposed to. My parents themselves are not particularly pious
Okay.
or religious.
Okay, well, that's an interesting thought. So you got the imprint of the cultural artifacts of that faith or way of being. And then what then awakened you to study and dive into religion in the way that you have?
A dissatisfaction with life
Oh, okay.
is one way to put it, or a feeling, a sense that things weren't quite the way they were supposed to be,
Okay.
very early on. And
Yeah.
I suppose I was a little less gullible, for lack of a better term, than some, or rather, I took things a little more seriously than others.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
is to say, I went to Catholic school, and we all
Yeah.
know what Catholic school is like.
I'm a Catholic, so I know.
It can be somewhat dogmatic and
Yeah.
traumatizing in many ways, and I've
Yeah.
experienced that. And I was expelled from my Catholic school, or invited to leave.
In France.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's because I was asking too many questions, mainly,
Yeah.
that other kids weren't asking. And so there was dissatisfied with the answers people were giving me, but also with the way in which people lived,
Right.
be it in my family or at school. Everywhere I'd look, things didn't seem quite right.
Right.
And so naturally that led me to philosophy,
Yeah.
the discipline that questions everything, calling
Yeah.
everything into question. But in philosophy, I didn't meet ancient Greek philosophers that were embodying their teachings. I met very intelligent people. I was
Yeah.
fortunate enough to study at elite institutions with the cleverest minds on earth, well, in the Western world in some ways. And yet I was somewhat disappointed by what I found.
Right.
It brought me a lot, and I learned tremendously through the power of the intellect.
Right.
And I could understand things on a whole other levels. I don't want to minimize the power of the intellect or
Yeah.
the importance that philosophy played in my life. So at the start, it was hugely liberating. It was enlightening in many ways. It was edifying in many ways. But at some point, I was dissatisfied again by people reflecting a lot and yet not really practicing what they were preaching, or not really embodying
Okay.
the teachings. So actually, the
Okay.
sociological studies have been conducted with philosophers, with ethicists, that show that ethicists or moral philosophers were no more moral than other people. And some even defended themselves by saying they shouldn't be expected to be more moral because they were simply studying ethics from a disinterested perspective like any other intellectual discipline, which is preposterous and ludicrous and makes no sense when it comes to the original goal of philosophy, to really not just love wisdom from this disinterested, lofty perspective, but to really embody, live out wisdom. But philosophy did give me a broader perspective on life, obviously, but also on science and on our current paradigm, basically,
Right.
and our scientific paradigm. Because rejecting religion, I was the Richard Dawkins type of anti-religious person.
Oh, you were?
I
Wow.
was, expelled from Catholic school. I thought it was all nonsense, and I just did not understand as a teenager why people believe this nonsense. But then I studied philosophy of science and philosophy of religion, and actually realized, oh, it's a lot more complex than I thought it was. I was very naive, needless to say. And then I was just at this time I could not understand why there were such clever academics who claimed to be religious, and how one could study such a thing as theology.
Yeah.
And then reading, Thomas Aquinas and Saint Augustine and all the great ones in Christian theology, and then other traditions, obviously made me realize, yes, there is more to it than that.
Right.
But I still did not understand why people went to church and prayed. It still baffled me why people practiced. And to me, because of my Western upbringing, even though I'm Eurasian, I was still very much brought up in the West with a Western mindset and worldview. I thought I have to get things right intellectually.
Right.
And so long as my ideas aren't clear, then I won't practice. I won't engage in any of these odd practices because first I need to know what I'm praying for too. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
But then at some point, I followed the advice that was given by my religious friends, spiritual friends, that is to go to church, to pray, to engage in these practices, even though I was sitting on the fence or unclear as to what I was really doing. And that had a tremendous impact upon me, one that is of a different kind to the wealth of knowledge that I had experienced, so to speak, through philosophy.
Yeah.
Basically, I discovered embodied practice. I discovered felt experience.
Okay.
And that was missing in my life in many ways.
Mm.
Even though I was exploring many things, it was still up here in the
Mm.
head, like it is for most of us in the West. And so a lot of people in France identify as religious but not practitioners. No, not sorry. So in English, you often hear, I'm spiritual but not religious.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in France, sometimes they still sort of loosely identify with Catholicism, nominal Christians, but they would say, I am. I need to think in French for a second. Croyant mais pas pratiquant. So believer but not a practitioner. Yeah, that's what they say. And you could say it was the other way around for me. I became a devoted practitioner, but I didn't identify as a believer.
Right.
And to this day, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me when people say, I'm a believer but not a practitioner, because belief in and of itself, intellectual understanding, is of little value unless it changes something in the world and in yourself.
Yeah.
And I'd much rather have someone who practices what they preach or preaches nothing but does something of value.
Yeah.
Even though both are important. And so at that stage in my life, I was very much all about practice because this brought so much to me. And I didn't care as much about extravagant or sophisticated theories that I had already explored, and it didn't really matter as much to me. And so I wasn't going to the best academics anymore. I was trying to find the people that devoted their entire lives to practice, to living out these spiritual truths, so to speak.
Yeah.
And I didn't find that in academia, even though I started out studying comparative religion and theology, and I did come across people who were both academics and practitioners. But the people that I found that were truly devoted were monks and nuns, were monastics, because they're the ones that really, left the world in some ways, depending on the order of the denomination of the tradition.
Yeah.
I also connected with a lot of priests and religious leaders, but they tended to be a little too concerned with socio-political matters.
Yeah. Yeah.
And in the monastery, so I went to several monasteries in the East and the West, mainly first Christian monasteries of different Christian traditions, and then Buddhist, Hindu, and there are no monasteries in Islam, but I also spent time in Muslim communities. And there I found people. And people are people.
Yeah.
And when you hear, I'm sure, having spending lots of time in spiritual circles and have spiritual masters and teachers, and people, especially people who are discovering spirituality, they think of the spiritually, not to say enlightened person, advanced person, as being perfect. And we tend to project that onto the priest or whoever embodies spiritual values or qualities.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's what I meant by people, because I also had these expectations of, I'm going to find saints that have figured everything out and that are one with God. Not quite true. I found people with their wounds and with their traumas, but I also found people who were quite exceptional.
Yeah.
But what moved me most wasn't the divine connection and being one with the stars. It was the simple daily things. The ordinary life. And as you know, if you've spent time in monasteries, and I presume you have, and many people who are listening to this probably have, it's how they pay attention to detail. Yeah. And to the things you do in between the things that are supposed to matter. Right? Yeah. So now the ceremony starts, or now the meal starts, but even the meal is just as important as the ceremony. And what you do between the ceremony and the meal is also just as important. Yeah. And so it's these moments in between, these moments that we don't usually pay attention to. And I don't mean to say we're always in a meditative state and we should pay attention to everything. It's not just that. It's really how, the order. That's the reason why also Christian communities are called, orders. And also I was living a rather chaotic life. So in a way, I personally needed some of that structure. And structure, as you know, also gives you space to relax into the structure, to trust the structure. So there are things that you don't need to worry about anymore. You know how things work. And that's also one of the functions of ritual. You know how things work, and sometimes you had to learn it, and it was hard, and that makes the ritual all the more powerful. And the fact that everyone else is doing the same thing and also went through the same thing and is doing it over and over again, that has great value. So it's more of the sort of the daily anthropological aspects of the monastic life that really impacted me, rather than trying to figure out something, my beliefs. It was really about delving deep into living the life that people thought would bring them closer to what they believe is of ultimate concern.
Well, that's an incredible story, and I love there's two or three things that really strike me about that. One thing I was curious about, that you stated at the beginning of this search, that the difference between philosophy and when you tried to practice was a kind of an embodied element. Of course, if you're studying at a high level, master's, PhD, of course, that's mostly intellectual. But traditional religions and churches don't strike me as, I mean, there's a lot of devotion and devotional acts or acts of the sacred, but they don't particularly feel to me embodied. So what was it about that what's the word, captivated you? What was it? What was the embodiment that was practiced that captivated you? You can do, as a Christian, there's a more modern thing, the centering prayer by Father Keating. That's kind of been adopted in lots of circles. That's a literal embodiment practice, but a regular Christian service, it's kind of like rote repetition without necessarily the felt sense, or only if people are genuine, there's some felt sense of the divine or God or Christ. So I'm curious about that, the captivation in the beginning. I mean, obviously there was a stark difference with the intellect, but kind of curious about that.
So yeah, so studying religion, spirituality, from an academic perspective, can be divorced from practice. It need not be the case. There are several institutions. I'm thinking Naropa in the US, or the California Center for Integral Studies, and various other institutions, the Aleph Trust that my friend Jessica Bockler founded, that you know quite well. So all of those institutions also blend practice and theory. And actually, I would advocate for starting with practice and then delving into the theory. Since when you have, say, an introduction to Buddhism, do a 1-week meditation retreat first, and then talk about Buddhism. That kind of thing. But to answer the latter part of your question, so yes and no, insofar as there are various strands within all traditions that are embodied, including Christianity. And it's funny because I was the one demonizing Christianity, and I was the first person condemning Christianity early on. And now I find myself oftentimes defending Christianity, also because I studied it for so many years, and because I'm aware, obviously, of the vast diversity of Christian traditions, and you can find virtually anything within Christianity and within most religions, for that matter. I personally am quite close to the Orthodox tradition. I was technically baptized Orthodox, and it has retained
Christian Orthodox.
Christian Orthodox, that's right. It has retained, and I say retained because there were always, and there has always been in different strands of Christianity, more so-called embodied practices. But it's true that the Orthodox tradition and the Orthodox liturgy, in a way, includes more chanting, more of those embodied, the centering prayer that you mentioned, the heart prayer, and it's a little less intellectual. Not to want to caricature Catholicism and the Orthodox tradition and Orthodoxy than other strands of Christianity. But we're talking about Christianity here. But what about Hindu traditions? What about Buddhist traditions? What about starting with doing 300 prostrations? I think that's quite embodied. Prostrations are found within Christianity. What we now call meditation, mindfulness practices are found within Christianity. Silent prayer has always been practiced within Christian traditions. So I'm not saying it's all the same and you can find everything everywhere, but I am saying that there are deeply embodied practices that can be found in any tradition, including Christianity.
Okay, well, that's one of the other things.
if
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
may add something,
Yeah.
I'm not saying that really fulfilled my need for embodiment.
No.
In many ways, so take the question of interpersonal relationships and sexuality or
Yeah.
sensuality. That is something that tends to be taboo and not really addressed in a lot of spiritual traditions.
Yeah.
And it's not something I found in the monastery,
No.
even though I did conduct research at the Vatican. And let's just say that some priests were a little too friendly towards me. So some cliches are true after all.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, but I did not meet my need for interpersonal sensuality in the Vatican either.
No.
No, so after, not after, I spent a lot of time in various temples and monasteries in parallel to my academic research, to my studies and to teaching. But then I was also disillusioned with that to some extent, and embodiment is one of those reasons.
Yeah.
And this is what led me to drop out of my first PhD, which was in theology.
Oh, right.
And yes, and to go to a drama school.
Right.
And I studied physical theatre at a place called Jacques Lecour School of Physical Theatre in Paris. And there I found just as much depth and beauty as in the monastery, but in very different ways, as you can imagine.
Yeah.
And a different kind of community as well.
Okay.
And I work. Yes. Sorry, did you have a question?
Well, I was struck by the way that you talked about, because it's from what I'm hearing, there's this sort of authentic desire for true religion or true experience that encompasses the whole. That's what I've heard so far in terms of your search. And I was quite interested in this notion when you talked about the monastic life of the God, the everything having significance in the monastic life, the peak moments or the moments of service and formal devotion and the regular routines, and somehow everything being imbued in monastic life with the divine, or that's what you found attractive, or that's what you discovered there and lit you up. So now you're bringing in the art. So let's just talk a bit more about that devotional side of the devotion before we get to the arts. And then I'd like to go back to that point about the embodied practices of theatre and what that enables. But I'm kind of curious about this sort of devotion and what you think it brings out in people. Because in a way, you're a very young modern man, but you've got an emphasis on the traditions that's quite unusual and not always the benefits and rich and depth of that aren't always that much in the public face or aren't that expressed or don't get the airtime because of the trauma that formal religion has created. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about how that transformed your vision and view.
Yes, you're right. That there's a lot of rejection of tradition, and understandably so. You mentioned the trauma. We need not go through all the horrors that came out of religions, of organized, institutionalized forms of religion. That's a fact. That's clear. That is not the kind of religion that I'm interested in.
No.
But people tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
And in secular forms of spirituality that either try to amalgamate or to bring together all sorts of little aspects of different traditions without really understanding those traditions very deeply or thoroughly, or who try to do away with tradition altogether and to reinvent the wheel. I think that's a great shame and tragedy, because we have all sorts of wheels that function perfectly well. And the fact that we have these traditions that have stood the test of time isn't just because of political control and imposing dogma upon people. That's one part of the story, and it's an important part of the story. but it's also because perhaps some of those practices actually work, and they've discovered interesting things about life that are worth preserving.
Yeah.
So, this is also two sides of it's a double-edged sword. There are two sides of the coin of tradition.
Yeah.
It's also we're also deluding ourselves if we think we can reinvent the wheel, because we're not. There's still always hybrid forms of what we already know, and it's replicating social beliefs and practices in different ways. So what I mean to say is there is great truth, beauty, and goodness in all traditions. So I follow Ken Wilber and others in saying that theories or religions or beliefs and practices are all true, but partially true.
Partially true.
but truth in the pragmatic sense, and not pragmatic meaning practical in the original philosophical sense. James Williams, John Dewey, and others. That is, the truth is what works, to simplify.
Yeah.
And so what I mean by what works is that they contribute to life, they reveal aspects of life, they enrich life in different ways, or they have means of enriching life, elevating life, making us see, understand, perceive, relate to aspects of life in different ways. And all traditions have that. Beyond the social purpose of bringing people together, so you could, and I don't just want to say it's the spiritual side of religion, and I definitely don't want to distinguish between religion and spirituality. That makes no sense. Well, you can, but that's not what I'm interested in here, and that tends to be dichotomous and simplistic. So the reason why, as a modern young man, as you put it, I value and cherish tradition so much beyond my background is simply because it's age-old wisdom. It's countless generations of studying, trying to understand, relating to life in a myriad ways, and it would be extremely foolish and vain to overlook that. And so that's for the wealth of beliefs and practices that traditions have to offer. Now, I also don't want to advocate for a synthesis, even though my ancestor, as I mentioned, did pioneer a syncretic tradition, which mainly draws upon Catholicism, Spiritism, which was trendy in the early 20th century, and Eastern traditions, Taoism, Confucianism, Buddhism. I don't think it's feasible to say we will study all world religions. So one way you could say a simplistic way is to say one is right, all the others are wrong. I'm going to try to find the right one. And in a way, I was also there. That's why. Another way is to say, yes, they're all right. We all blend, but they'll get things wrong. So we keep the right bits and we put them together, and we'll get the right piece of the puzzle. I actually think a meta-modern perspective, which is not quite the same as including and transcending, the Wilberian approach, but to say we can navigate between them, may be more appropriate or more interesting at this stage in human development. And that is to say, trying to hold different perspectives at the same time. That are embodied perspectives, not simply, oh yes, I understand. So to give you the analogy of, we're talking about religion here, but it's much broader than that. It's more about the different ways of relating to the world, of understanding the world, of being in the world. And so religion is just a framework, but we could talk about philosophical ideologies or schools of thought or political ideologies and so on and so forth. Religion here is a model in a way. So where was I? Yes. And I'll also give you another analogy, and that's of polyamory, which is a relationship type that some people practice. However, you cannot have 10 partners if you really want to be intimate with them, so only 7 days in the week. So maybe 2, maybe 3, 4, maybe. So similarly, you can't study all religions and practice all religions and understand intimately all religions. Again, maybe 1, maybe 2. And I would even say that I'm, in a way, against conversion, because I don't want to say wasting time, but people tend to demonize their own tradition if they experience trauma, and to idealize other traditions. It's exotic. It's they romanticize, exoticize, in the West, New Age traditions tend to do that with Eastern traditions, and now we do it with indigenous traditions, and there's a great deal we can learn from them. But basically, monotheism, mainly Christianity, bad, dark, dogmatic, and Buddhism, Hinduism, sexy, colorful, and non-dogmatic.
Yeah.
Obviously, not quite right. Yeah.
No. Especially when you encounter the people, like you were pointing out earlier.
That's right. That's right. Yeah. The good and the bad on both sides, as always. People are people, and those traditions as being vehicled through people. So where was I going with this?
Metamodernism, multiple perspectives.
Sorry, I can't hear you, Dave.
You started talking about metamodernism and multiple perspectives. Oh.
I think...
I can hear me through my microphone.
Oh, yes, now I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
We were trying to reveal secrets that the internet was not supposed to know. That's why.
Right.
But no.
Yeah, you kind of were responding to my kind of encouragement to talk about, the devotional practices.
Yes,
and then
I remember
talking
now.
From a kind of meta-modern perspective of how to engage, but you didn't quite finish it off.
Yes. I'll spell it out just now because they sound like big words, but they're really not. And I'll then return to devotion because I know it's a big detour I'm taking, but I think it's a necessary one.
Yeah.
Yes. So the basic point here is navigating, moving between different embodied ontologies. Again, big words, different ways of relating to the world.
Yeah.
And if you think as religion not as a set of beliefs and practices, orthodoxy and orthopraxy, but as ways of relating to the world and of experiencing the world. That's what I'm most interested in. And if you think of 3 levels, that is the interfaith, interspiritual, and interreligious.
Yeah.
Not quite in the right order, doesn't matter. And then, so one, say, interfaith is mainly talking about belief. And it's religious leaders that say, oh, yeah, you believe in this, I believe in that. We compare dogma, beliefs, or practices. And then one is about customs. So it's, you celebrate Hanukkah, I celebrate Christmas, we celebrate this, I invite my neighbor over, interreligious perhaps. But an interspiritual, more interesting to me at least, or different, is to say, what are you experiencing when you are praying or you're meditating? Individually and collectively. And it's that level of experience, of felt experience, that is of interest. And trying to really inhabit those traditions, experience them deeply. And some say if you want to find water, you're better off digging a deep well rather than 10 different wells. You can have 2 or 3 ones that are deep enough. So that was the analogy with polyamory, meaning like as also because in the West there is more and more diversity and people like me who are mixed race. I'm to say, so what should I be choosing? And also because we're in secular society, we're not necessarily raised with religions. But I did want also to mention conversion very briefly. And I said I was against conversion. That was a bold claim. I'm not against conversion as such. It's perfectly fine if people convert. What I mean is that religion is also intertwined with culture, embedded in culture. So whether or not we like it, we are Christian in many ways. We're also Greco-Roman in many ways. And so all of a sudden saying, I'm going to become a Tibetan Buddhist, you can do that, but unless you speak Tibetan, it's also very much embedded in language. And you spend 20 years in Tibet, which would be tricky, but with Tibetans, then you can perhaps call yourself a Tibetan Buddhist. Otherwise, you're bound to remain this hybrid form of Western Tibetan Buddhism, which is fine. And there can be such a form, but I'd say you may miss out on certain things. It will take you much longer to get to the depth of understanding of Tibetan Buddhism because it's not your culture. Whilst if you stay with Christianity, if you grew up Christian or in a Christian culture, or Muslim or Hindu, whatever, and you can branch out and explore the traditions, but I would say really explore your own and see the beauty and depth and truth that you can find within your own tradition or traditions, and that's of your country, of your family, and it could be multiple ones. Okay, so that's for conversion. Yes.
I had another question, but you hadn't quite finished.
No, please, let's make it more dynamic. I don't want it to be a half an hour monologue.
But I think what I find, unique about you and the what you're presenting now is so thoroughly thought through and researched. And often I find what I come across as spiritual or religious, whatever people label themselves, like you're saying about, your conditioning patterns, your relationship to whatever the faith it is you're engaging in. That's what you're saying, or there's hidden structures in there that you're not aware of. But I think one of my critiques would be, and I'm interested in your response to this, is I don't think sufficient attention is even to take on the practices deeply enough, because without taking the practices, whatever faith tradition it comes from, you don't really discover these other layers of yourself that are a barrier to sort of, growing wisdom or growing light or growing awareness or consciousness. Because I think what you're pointing to is quite rare, and often I find people are good at the intellectual sophistication, but not necessarily haven't done the depth of work on themselves. So,
So what you're saying, if I make sure I get
yeah,
your point correctly, is that people are not willing to commit time, or people don't have time, or don't have the energy, the space, the mental capacity, emotional capacity to really engage deeply with those practices for what I'm saying to be of any value or to be fruitful.
yes, largely the field within which the seeds of experience are falling isn't that fertile.
That's a fair point. I would say I would say that's right to some extent. We just need to spend more time. But I would also say time is relative.
Yeah.
As you know, a 10-minute DMT experience or a 10-day Vipassana retreat or 100 days in silence can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
And that's not necessarily as part of traditions.
No.
So there are simple practices like that, like being in silence, being in nature, that can be very, very impactful, and you can experience a lot more than 10 minutes, 10 days, or 100 days.
Yeah.
And I would also say we carry within ourselves much more than we think. We're much more than we think we are.
Right.
The countless generations that have come before us. And I'm not going to say something woo like all the cells in our bodies resonate and vibrate with the entire universe, but to some extent, yes, and so it's not just about our story; it's how it relates to the broader story and how we perhaps connect to the collective unconscious and so on and so forth. So it's not just about I've only devoted I've done my 100 I've done my 10,000 hours of meditation. Now what? And I also sorry.
I'm conscious of time, and we've gone very deep in the first half of the interview, but there's some couple of other areas that I think were worth teasing out in terms of your approach. So
I'd love to answer the question, Dave, but can I just say, because I do want to get through my final point, and I won't talk about devotion unless you really want to address that, but about the different ways of relating to life, because the whole preface, so to speak, was only as I said, a preface to be able to talk about those different embodied ontologies, as I called them.
Yeah.
Because I think we're focusing too much on what we tend to categorize as religion and spirituality, and that alienates a lot of people, or is only of interest to those who are interested in it. So unfortunately, we've already lost those who are not interested in it, and they may not listen to your channel anymore. But that's a huge shame, because those who benefit most are those who are not interested. Because as we know, to me, spirituality is the simplest definition I have and that I like, is embracing reality as it is, being at peace with what is, and living a full human life.
Right.
And my journey has been, even though it was about lofty ideas originally, but then it became a lot more about the ordinary, the down-to-earth, the tangible. And then maybe that brings you up and down. Who cares, But it's about, in a way, simple things, even though we are talking about intellectual things right now. So these embodied ontologies. Philippe Descola, a French anthropologist, Lévi-Strauss's last student, wrote a popular book called Beyond Nature and Culture, in which he presents 4 different ontologies, simply ways of perceiving the world and of relating to the world. And they're based on one's interiority and externality or physicality. So interiority, mind, consciousness, what happens in here, externality, physicality, matter, or not, sorry, not matter, what's out there. Simple. In our culture, we think we are internally special, we're unique, we experience things in a very different way to all the rest of the world.
Yeah.
But we think that the matter out there is the same as the matter in here, atoms, molecules, and so on. Yeah. And we see each other separate from nature, as we know, nature versus culture.
Yeah.
And then there are 3 other ontologies that are based on the other options. So same externality, same exteriority, same, different, you get the idea. Animism, same internality, different exteriority. Totemism, different. No, an analogism, different. See, I don't even remember. You get, there are 4 different options. That's what I mean. Yeah. And they're varied, but again, who cares what they are? What the important point is that they're very different ways of relating to the world and of being in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. And you could say, just like different religions sometimes are also very different ways of engaging with the world and of experiencing the world, or are an entry into different ways of experiencing the world. And you could even say, just like language is, as you know, having learned Dutch where you're now, right? And I'm here learning one of my mother tongues, weirdly enough, Vietnamese again. Language also gives you, to some extent, a different experience of the world.
Yeah.
And I think this is the best analogy and the analogy I have between those different ontologies and also different religions and different languages, because languages are able to capture different aspects of reality, as we know, different for snow in different Innu languages, different words, and to describe different things in more or less subtle ways. There are things that languages can't express properly. And we all know the limitations of language. Right. So you could say same thing about religion. Religion also captures certain aspects of reality, perhaps. So I'm not saying it's all the same. I'm also saying there could be a hierarchy. There could be actually their understanding of the psyche of the mind, maybe a little more subtle in some ways than theirs, and that's fine. Just like we have, slightly more subtle ways to describe snow in one culture and in another. Yeah. But I'm not saying we should learn all languages in the world. We can't do that. No. I'm not saying we should understand all religions in the world, and I'm not saying we should all be animist and totemist and analogy. We can't do that. But I'm saying we can broaden our perspective, not just from this intellectual perspective of, yes, I have read lots of books about animism and everything. And also, I'm not saying we should try to become animists. We are naturalists. We can't become animists. We can't become totemists unless we really move to the Amazon and live there for the rest of our lives, just like we can't become Tibetan Buddhists unless, or we become hybrid forms, which is fine. But the hybrid is looking for a synthesis. Here I'm saying, how can we, from our perspective, try as best we can to navigate between these ways of relating to the world and to engage with them from this really embodied, for lack of a better term, from this felt experience perspective, again, for lack of a better term. So yes, so that's what I mean by sort of, we need to move between different ontologies in this deeply embodied way. And so we need to realize that there is no I lost my train of thought again. Give me a second. Yes. Not trying to find what the right one is. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily wanting to synthesize them. Yeah. And being okay with the paradoxes without trying to reconcile them. Yeah. We know that on some level they can be reconciled and they make sense. But here I'm actually speaking about a simpler level. Mm-hmm. And I'll briefly connect that with the arts. Yeah. But before I do that, I want you to ask a question because you wanted to speak about other things.
Well, I think, what you're talking about is the gift of this time and this moment of education, of fluidity, of knowledge, of availability of all kinds of sources of wisdom, thanks to the internet and the communication. So you're talking about kind of almost a kind of 21st century and beyond not methodology, but encouragement to experience you could say spirit in multiple forms as oneself. That's what I'd summarize what you've just said. But I'm conscious of time, and there's quite other two more big dimensions to your work that we haven't touched upon. So you were alluding to this shift to theatre and how there was a kind of satisfaction with the arts that brought I'm putting words in your mouth, but a deeper synthesis or a more satisfying way, or brought another dimension in for you. So I don't know if you could wrap that up also with the psychotherapeutic, so that we can get a fuller picture of your offer as, in the Institute for the Devotional Arts, because I just find the whole thing fascinating. The depth of your knowledge and wisdom is very impressive. So I'd love to kind of get a flavor of the other two domains before we have to close.
Certainly.
And it's also just a pleasure, to listen to someone who is so fluent in so many different dimensions. It's really a privilege to listen to this.
Well, it's kind of you to say, Dave, but I really think it's something we all have.
Yeah.
And something we all have access to. And the reason why some people say, "Oh yes, I dreamt of becoming an artist."
Yeah.
It's not because they want what we call art in our society. That is, someone who is selling works of art, who is famous, someone who has this position.
Yeah.
It's because some of the things that some artists, not all artists, even though they're called artists, have access to, is what we long for.
Yeah.
And I think people deep down remember that.
Yeah.
And it's some of the things we've lost. And art is one way, just like spiritual practices are another way.
Yeah.
Of retrieving those different modes of perception.
Yeah.
And even though it may sound inaccessible when I say we have to navigate between the totemist and the animist and the naturalist perspectives, worldviews, I don't think it is that inaccessible. Because, as I said, I think we have it within us, because our ancestors were animists and totemists. And also naturalism is very recent. Again, we should be reminded that AI has been around for a few years, and internet for a few decades, electricity, not even for a few centuries. It's crazy. That's crazy to think.
Yeah.
So we've been around for millions of years. And so let's not underestimate impact is not quite a right word here, but the importance, the significance of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah.
And not just psychology, of evolution in general, and what we carry within us. So in physical theatre, I worked a lot with mask work. And you think theatre and mask, you think you hide things and you pretend. But I was never interested in theatre as interpretation, just like I'm not so interested in psychology as fixing problems.
Yeah.
Even though theatre as interpretation can be great and has great value, and fixing problems is also very important, and I also want more of that.
Yeah.
Does my personal interests lie in the realm of theatre as deepening life?
Yeah.
And also therapy as deepening human experience.
Yeah.
And when you have a mask, masks are also used in all sorts of cultural, spiritual, religious traditions, whatever you want to call them.
Yeah. Yeah.
Such as Bali. And so you don't wear the mask or don a mask, you enter the mask and you serve the mask, and you are the vehicle for what the mask needs to express.
Yeah.
And here what you often hear, and that's partially true as always, is you need to be a vehicle. You need to let things express themselves through you. And you are, and that's what theatre makers like Grotowski advocated. And I agree, but that's lots of people can say that. The thing I would want to add is not just you're an empty vessel of the divine, of whatever force flows through you. Like any artist knows, that's in the state of inspiration, spirit, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's also response. And that's the opposite to self-expression. Because we think art, self-expression. It's me sharing something with the world.
Yeah.
Whilst I think devotion definitely has this aspect of I allow something to flow through me, yes,
Yeah.
but this allowing can be seen as response.
Mm-hmm.
And response from a place of deep observation. And I think we vastly underestimate the place of observation in our lives, and especially in Western society. We're a hyperactive society. We try to get stuff done. Productivity is what it's all about. Efficiency, productivity, right brain, left brain, I can't remember, but you know, that kind of focus.
Yeah.
And when I mean by observation, it's not being spectators. Because again, in the arts, usually you have actors and spectators. You have the artist that's active, and you have the spectator, the audience that's passive. So I'm not talking about this kind of passive observation, which is being a spectator, which can even involve judgment.
Yeah.
Which is why we have art critics. Historically, there were no art critics because art was part and parcel of life. Just like you don't have an art critic in church when people are singing. So you actually today, you know, because the point is not so much aesthetic perfection, which is what we aim for today. Just like in sport, it's about, who can jump the highest and run the fastest and so on. It's about competition to some extent. Who can do better than the other person. So it's not so much about aesthetic perfection, and that is in the artist. And it's not so much about aesthetic pleasure, and that is in the spectator. It's about the shared aesthetic experience, which is more than aesthetics. And here, obviously, you have the horizontal dimension of it's about bringing people together, and you have the vertical dimension. It's about honoring that which is greater than us. Call that nature the divine, or whatever you want to call it.
And who was that theatre maker? The French?
Not French, Polish. Well, I mean, there are several, but I mentioned Grotowski.
Grotowski, okay, yeah.
But actually, Grotowski, psychologically, the way in which he treated his disciples, because it was a bit of a sect, was quite traumatic. And so, despite the depth of the work, I would say not as psychologically healthy as it could have been, unfortunately. And so, just to continue with the example of the mask and serving the mask, and also the example of responding. Actually, I'll set aside the mask for a second. And I was talking about this place of observer. Which is that of a witness. And a witness has responsibility. Their duty is to report back. So they need to directly observe and to be very attentive, to remember, so that you can see there's a passive observer, to simplify, that of the spectator, and there's the active witness. And as you know, in our society, when I said there's little place for observation, contemplation, not a word I use very often in daily life. What are you doing? People go on retreats, but they try to have a daily practice, but it's not something that's really promoted in our culture, even though mindfulness is more and more important. But take the extreme, hermits. In many cultures, hermits are revered. People bring them food. People understand, even though it's maybe become a tradition and people don't really think about it, there's a place for this, the deepest observation there could be, completely removing yourself from society. And I'm not saying advocating that, and no, everyone can do that. But that's just to show the extreme example of the value of the deepest kind of observation, perhaps. Yes? And so I'm advocating, art, not as the creative process, art as response. Or creating from a place of observation. And to use the example of song. As you know, in certain spiritual traditions, you ingest certain plants that allow you to have certain experiences. And the guides, shamans, sing songs. And they claim that those songs were communicated to them by the plants themselves. And so they are perhaps responding to the call of the plant. So art as a response to the call of the world, rather than thinking that we are initiating, we're calling out, we're doing stuff, we're sharing stuff with the world. Actually, couldn't we shift the perspective and think, we are responding to the world? If it's call and response, I think we're not so much the call, but more the response. And then the devotional urge, because I do think it's a fundamental need that we all have to give thanks,
Yeah.
to celebrate, to worship, to praise, words that are rarely used outside of organized religion.
Yeah.
I think that's a great tragedy because, as I
Mm.
said, it's a fundamental need. And we long for that. That's why we've come to sacralize hot chocolate, because we need these moments of communion and of
Yeah.
devotion.
Yeah.
And as you know, in the Bhagavad Gita, it's one of the four main paths. It may
Yeah.
suit certain temperaments, not others. I'm not saying we should all be on our knees and praying all the time, but I'm saying there should be spaces for devotion and solemnity. And there are definitely spaces for that in a monastery, but it should also be spaces for laughter and not taking things too seriously. So it's also about balancing out and navigating between these experiences that are central to life and existence. And so to wrap things up, to perhaps, if I can try to bring together the devotional, the artistic, and the therapeutic. First, I'll say something about the therapeutic because I didn't touch upon it much. We pathologize everything in our culture. We try to come up with the next mental disorder, and that are often reflections of the problems in our society and culture. But I like to think that beyond just fixing problems, and we need to address trauma, and it's very real, and I don't want to undermine that at all. But instead of saying, let's try to eliminate the problem, how can we use it to explore the psyche a little more deeply?
Yeah.
How can we use it to say, what is this trying to tell me? What is this trying to show me? And to engage with that in an imaginal way, in a way that's not necessarily rational, and it's not necessarily even embodied.
Yeah.
Or that is, not trying to say, okay, yes, this represents that. I saw this image or this character that way. It emits my anger and it represents my father. No, none of that. How can we engage with the image, as I think James Hillman could put it?
Mm.
So how can we think of psychotherapy in its original sense? That is the care of the soul.
Right.
Suke, obviously, psyche is the soul. Let's not forget.
Yeah.
And again, following Hillman here, I would say maybe we need more of this. I'm a pluralist, and I try not to, even though I want to reconcile paradoxes, to say that may not be the way forward. And on some level, they can't be reconciled, and that's okay. So how can we engage with our the different selves, different aspects of our personality, whatever you want to call that? And how can we create space and room for them to express themselves through us, and for us to respond to the other selves, for lack of a better term, not an appropriate term here, in the world. Mm-hmm. And so how can we use psychotherapy to deeply engage with the human experience?
Right.
Just like spirituality, just like the arts.
Yeah.
And to also, I said it may suit different temperaments. I also said, so I want to I want to relativize what I'm saying by saying it depends on your story. It also depends on the different moments in your life. So there is flexibility and fluidity that is cultural, that is temporal, on lots of different levels. That's what I mean.
Yeah.
So I'm not presenting a solution to anything. No. My background's in philosophy, and the main role of philosophy is to bring nuance and subtlety.
Yeah.
And because of what I went through in my life, I would say I'm hoping that to bring that nuance. Now we're having this conversation, so it's mainly intellectual, but actually most of my work is about translating that into more than intellectual means of relating and being.
Yeah. So I kind of want to make a kind of synthesis here of what I feel I've heard, and what kind of stands out or most salient from what you said today. The kind of art of devotion, the art of art. Sorry, there's the art of devotion, and there's art as devotion, as response, as well as call, and then psychotherapy in terms of healing the soul primarily, as opposed to fixing medical issues, as it were. So the so that's a summary. I don't think it's a synthesis, but there's an interesting multi-dimensional nature to that you embody, that you're bringing to your work. And maybe there's something you'd like to share with the listeners that you're doing in the near future that encapsulates these three dimensions. Maybe there's something you'd like to invite people to do or engage with you in or on.
Yes. Now, briefly touch on what you just said.
Okay, yeah,
Because
please do.
you used the word healing,
Yeah,
which is thrown around these days. And I do want to remind people and myself that healing originally shares the same root etymology as wholeness,
wholeness.
being
Yeah,
whole,
yeah,
rather than fixing symptoms.
yeah,
And I also mentioned language. I do think looking at where words come from and how they were used originally and mythologically is very important.
yeah,
And I didn't say much about art in our conversation. We talked mainly about spirituality and different ways of perceiving the world. But I would say one more thing, and I think in Islam, as you know, in certain strands of Islam, art is pretty much banned, forbidden,
yeah,
unless it's spiritual art.
yeah,
And I think they're partly right. They're not to ban art, obviously, obviously not, just to be controversial. We should just ban. No, they're partly right because they see the power of art
yeah,
to
yeah,
seduce, but also to perceive things in a different way. And here we're talking about the visual arts, but it's much broader than that. And also when we think of art in our very visual culture, also a dominant sense, just like we overemphasize certain aspects of life, we forget other art forms. And I mentioned theatre, and I do want to say one last word about theatre. That is how I said I wasn't so much interested in theatre as interpretation, but as theatre to deepen the human experience. But also from a more basic social perspective, theatre to reveal that society is also a play.
yeah,
One doesn't need to quote Shakespeare on this, or Leela, the divine play, as the Hindu call it. Some of really just, it's a great way to deconstruct things from daily life, saying actually the actor needs to understand how people live to be a good actor.
Yes, yeah,
And it sometimes what happens on stage, or on stage to say in the theatrical context, may be more real, or there may be more truth to it than in society.
yeah,
Because in society, people play roles they don't want to play, and sometimes that they haven't chosen, and sometimes they may not be fully aware of it. Maybe sometimes they automata or cogs in a machine, whilst on stage or rather in a theatrical context, it need not be a stage, it need not be representational. People have to be aware of it, acutely aware of it, and they have chosen it.
Yeah.
And so in that sense, theatre can be a deeply transformational practice to better engage with and understand the human experience. And it's also good fun.
My wife's a training actress, and one of the biggest reservations she has to overcome with people and persuade them to enter is because they don't see it as real. But in fact, what you're saying is actually it can be realer than some of the other roles. It can be more reality there than some of the other roles we're playing because of the way that society functions.
And to also bring it together with tradition and innovation, for lack of a better term, I say theatre, so I train in physical theatre as a particular kind of theatre, but also a lot of improvisation.
Yeah.
And that's also a great way of realizing that everything we do, we've learned. We were conditioned to do certain things, but most of it we're not aware of. Just like learning a new language makes you realize, oh yeah, that's how I say it in my language. I never thought of it this way. This is what this word really means. Of course, these realizations, linguistic realizations, you get socially, but also you could say existentially. with theatre and with improvisation. Because with improvisation, all of a sudden you have to be aware of every single thing. Like, oh, I'm just lifting my arm up. What's happening? Why am I doing this? You know? And you also have to say yes to everything. That's the basic rule of improvisation, isn't it?
Yeah.
So another great spiritual practice in many ways. We'll forget spiritual practices. Another great life practice. But the reason why I was bringing in improvisation and to connect it with spirituality, yes, is because I think we need spaces of creative spirituality in which we are aware that tradition is a dynamic process, will always change and evolve. It's unavoidable, and it's good. The present schisms, the sects, even the cults that are branching out of our present religions will be the religions of tomorrow. Christianity, Islam, it comes from Judaism, Buddhism comes from Hinduism, and who knows what will come in 100 years, 500 years, you know. However, at some point, they develop an orthopraxy and an orthodoxy. Now we do this, now we believe that. Because we need that to be able to orient ourselves in the world. We need those categories. But how can we have spaces in which we say, okay, we are working with these practices, beliefs, traditions. We know that they're changing, but actually we are actively engaged in bringing out, letting those changes emerge. And not just saying, oh yeah, we'll just think about it. But as I said, on this interspiritual way, and also in this creative way. And so when it comes to the space of improvisation, to give you just a practice that you'll be familiar with, many listeners, say take systemic constellations. This is a space, you could say, of improvisation. However, unlike comedy improvisation, because a lot of improvisation in theatre improvisation tends to be about making things interesting and funny. Otherwise, it's boring. Whilst in family constellations, that's not the point at all. The point is to let things emerge. So similarly, how can we have these spaces in which you're not trying to make things interesting? You're not trying to express yourself. You know, you are also, things will flow through you, but you're trying to respond to what's happening in this different way, in these different ways, of perceiving the world, of engaging with the world, of being in the world. And so what do I want to invite your listeners to do? They can come to our events, because I work mainly with groups. And also one last thing about psychotherapy, in our culture, it tends to be a lot of one-on-one psychotherapy. There is group psychotherapy, but it's not that common. Whilst we've evolved in tribes, we need to recreate those collectives, those communities. And there is just as much value in collective therapeutic processes, even when they're not called therapy. I lived in lots of intentional communities. I'll give you just one simple practice called the Zeg Forum, for example, which involves, the theory goes, there are things about yourself that you know that you don't usually show others. There are things that others know about you that they don't tell you. But if you show things about yourself that you don't usually show at others, and if they do likewise, something else will emerge that neither you nor them knows. So it's more of these collective practices that we need, and so that people can act as witnesses and guides to each other. And so in my events, because they're mainly in-person events at this stage, so an expressive therapy training that I'm offering in Spain, for example, at the end of April, beginning of May. We're organizing singing tours in Georgia. That's all on our website, devotionalarts.org.
I'll make sure there's links when I share. So
certainly. And people can also connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm easy to find with my name, Swan Dao. And I'd love to also myself. I'm not living in community at the moment, and one of the reasons why we're having this conversation is to build this virtual community, and ideally also meet in person physically at some point. But it's to build bridges between disciplines, between communities, so that we can keep growing and learning from each other.
That's a great note on which to end, to keep learning from each other. That's what this phenomenal conversation is all about. So I'm going to press stop, and then I'll have a couple of words with you before we finish.